When I first moved into the neighborhood, I kept hearing the same warning over and over again: watch out for the HOA. It came from neighbors leaning over fences, from friends who had lived in other communities, even from random strangers online who wrote long, angry rants about how HOAs were nothing but trouble. They said these boards were full of nosy people with nothing better to do than measure grass length with rulers and send fines if you left your garbage can out too long. And honestly, I believed them, because it was easy to. I had never dealt with a homeowners association before, but I had seen enough memes and horror stories to think of them as miniature dictatorships. So the day I signed the paperwork on my new house, I already felt like I had put myself in the middle of enemy territory. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was perfect for me. The street was quiet, and I thought maybe I had lucked out with a neighborhood where the HOA just didn't care as much as everyone claimed. But then, small things started to catch my attention, things I might have ignored if I wasn't already primed to see them as warning signs. I noticed envelopes with the HOA logo sticking out of people's mailboxes, and almost every time I checked, the homeowner looked annoyed when they pulled it out. I passed a community meeting one night at the clubhouse and saw a handful of stern-looking people in suits flipping through binders, frowning as if they were preparing for a trial instead of a neighborhood discussion. Even walking my dog, I'd overhear quick complaints like, "Ugh, another letter from them," or "they're not leaving me alone about the shutters." It was like the HOA was everywhere, watching quietly, waiting for the right moment to pounce. My own mailbox stayed empty of their letters for the first couple of weeks, but that didn't make me relax. It made me nervous, like a storm I knew was coming. I started second-guessing little things I did. Was my grass too long? Was my car parked at too sharp an angle in the driveway? Was the wreath on my door against some obscure seasonal decoration rule I hadn't read yet? Every time I pulled into my driveway, I scanned the street like I was expecting a hidden HOA inspector to jump out and slap me with a fine. The worst part was how isolated it made me feel. Instead of seeing the HOA as a group of neighbors trying to keep the community nice, I saw them as faceless enforcers who had all the power and none of the heart. Even though I had never spoken to a single one of them, I was already building this picture in my head of cold, clipboard-wielding people who thrived on making others miserable. My friends didn't help either. When I mentioned I hadn't gotten a notice yet, they laughed and said, "Don't worry, you will. They always find something." And so every day I checked my mailbox with a strange mix of dread and anticipation, waiting for the inevitable. Then one evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the streetlights flickered on, I saw something that froze me in place. A white SUV with the HOA logo rolled slowly down the street, pausing in front of each house as someone inside scribbled notes on a clipboard. When it stopped in front of mine, I felt my stomach knot. The person inside looked up at my yard, scribbled something, and then drove off without a word. It felt like a warning shot, like I was already on their radar, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the next time I opened my mailbox, there'd be an envelope waiting with my name on it. I told myself it was probably nothing, but the tension only grew. By now, the HOA had transformed from a vague idea into a looming presence, and I couldn't help but wonder what they were going to hit me with first. And yet, deep down, there was a tiny sliver of curiosity too, because as much as everyone insisted the HOA was only trouble, I hadn't actually experienced it myself. I didn't know yet that the moment I finally got that letter, everything I thought I knew about HOAs would start to unravel most unexpectedly. The letter showed up on a Wednesday afternoon, tucked neatly in my mailbox like it had been waiting for me all along, and the moment I saw the HOA logo stamped across the top, my chest tightened, as if I'd been caught doing something wrong. I carried it inside like it might explode in my hands, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at it for a good 5 minutes before I worked up the nerve to open it. In my head, I pictured a laundry list of violations: too many weeds in the flower bed, trash can visible from the street, maybe even a fine I couldn't afford. When I finally tore it open, my heart dropped and then stopped because it wasn't what I expected at all. The letter wasn't written in cold legal jargon. It was friendly, even conversational, with a little smiley face at the end of the closing. It said something like, "Welcome to the neighborhood. We noticed your lawn might need a quick trim before the weekend." Just a friendly reminder to keep it looking sharp. If you need help, let us know. We have a list of great local landscapers. That was it. No threats, no dollar amounts, no talk of penalties. Just a note that sounded almost like advice from a neighbor who cared about curb appeal. But instead of being reassured, I felt unsettled because it was too nice, like the kind of politeness someone uses when they're buttering you up before they lower the hammer. I kept rereading it, trying to find the hidden dagger between the lines. Why would they include landscaper recommendations if they didn't expect me to comply immediately? Why the friendly tone when everyone swore HOAs thrived on intimidation? It felt like a trick, and I couldn't shake the thought that this was only the beginning. The next day I walked around the block and noticed other people pulling letters from their mailboxes too, but their reactions were mixed. One man shook his head and tossed his letter straight into the recycling bin. Another woman actually smiled when she read hers and muttered something like, "Oh good, they reminded me before it got out of hand." That confused me even more. How could the same HOA that was supposedly a neighborhood villain be writing letters that made someone smile? That night, when I was taking my dog out, I noticed a woman I hadn't seen before standing at the edge of my driveway, clipboard in hand, pen poised like she was about to write something down. I braced myself, ready for confrontation, but when she noticed me, she smiled warmly and introduced herself as the HOA president. I can't describe how surreal it was. She didn't look like the villain I had imagined, no stiff suit or icy glare, just a friendly face in a cardigan who asked if I was settling into the house okay. My guard shot up instantly. I gave short, polite answers, waiting for the inevitable pivot into criticism, but instead she said, "We really like to make sure everyone feels welcome here. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything." Then she wished me a good evening and walked away, as if that was all she had come for. I stood there with my dog tugging at the leash, completely thrown off. Was this her strategy? Disarm me with kindness so I wouldn't see the fine coming? Or was it possible, just possible, that maybe this HOA wasn't like the horror stories I had heard? That idea sat in the back of my mind all night, but by the time I went to bed, suspicion had crept back in. It had to be a game. I told myself it was only a matter of time before their true colors showed, and I needed to be ready for it. The problem was, the next time a letter showed up in my mailbox, it was just as polite, even thoughtful, reminding me about trash pickup changes due to the holiday weekend. Again, no fines, no stern demands, just useful information. I tried to convince myself they were lulling me into complacency, but part of me was starting to wonder if I had been too quick to judge. Still, I wasn't ready to let go of the warnings I had heard. Everyone said the HOA always found a way to make your life miserable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my turn was coming. So I kept my lawn trimmed, parked my car carefully, and followed every guideline I could remember, waiting for the trap to spring. What I didn't realize at the time was that the real test wasn't going to be about lawns or garbage cans at all. It was going to come when something much bigger went wrong, and that was when the HOA would finally reveal who they really were. The letters didn't stop after that second one, and each time I found a new envelope waiting in my mailbox, I felt that same rush of dread before I opened it, convinced this would finally be the moment the HOA showed its true colors. But instead of the threats and fines I had been warned about, they kept sending these strangely polite reminders and helpful notes, everything from telling me about community recycling events to offering a heads up about a road closure down the street. It was almost unsettling, like when you watch a magician shuffle a deck of cards and you know a trick is coming but can't figure out how they're doing it. Part of me wanted to relax, to believe maybe I had stumbled into the one neighborhood with a decent HOA, but another part of me couldn't let go of the stories I'd been told. Everyone said they were ruthless, and I didn't want to be the naive new neighbor who let their guard down and then got slammed with penalties I couldn't fight. The strangest moment came one evening when there was a knock at my door. Just as I was settling in to watch TV, my heart sank when I opened it and saw a man in a neatly pressed shirt holding a clipboard with the HOA's logo at the top. He introduced himself as one of the board members and asked if he could come in for a moment to explain a few things about the community guidelines. I almost said no on instinct, but something about his calm, easy manner made me step aside. He didn't lecture me or rattle off rules like a cop writing a ticket. He actually sat at my table, sipping the glass of water I offered, and went through the most common issues people ran into when they first moved in. It wasn't threatening at all. In fact, it felt like he was trying to help me avoid trouble before it happened. Still, the way he kept glancing around, jotting little notes on his clipboard, made my stomach twist. Was he secretly writing down violations to use against me later? Was this just a softer approach to surveillance? When he left, thanking me for the water and wishing me a great evening, I closed the door and leaned against it, unsure of what to think. If this was intimidation, it was the nicest version I had ever seen, and that only made me more suspicious. Over the next couple of weeks, the pressure seemed to build in little ways. I noticed the HOA president driving by slowly again, looking at houses and writing things down, and every time she paused in front of mine, I tensed up like I was about to be singled out. I overheard 2 neighbors complaining about how strict the rules were when it came to yard decorations, and another muttering angrily about getting yet another notice in the mail. I wanted to ask them more to get details, but I felt like if I showed too much interest, the HOA would somehow find out and come down on me harder. So I kept my distance, living in this constant push and pull between paranoia and doubt. It didn't help that I started finding subtle reminders of their presence everywhere I looked. Signs at the park about community rules, neatly posted announcements on the clubhouse door, and flyers taped to lampposts reminding everyone about safety checks. It was like the HOA was woven into every part of the neighborhood, and I couldn't escape the feeling they were watching, even when they were being nice about it. One night, I saw a small group gathered outside the clubhouse laughing and chatting, clipboards tucked under their arms. At first glance, it looked like a group of friends having a casual conversation, but the sight made me uneasy because in my mind, those clipboards were symbols of power, and I was certain my name was written on one of them. I went home and lay awake, imagining all the scenarios where they might call me out publicly at a meeting or send me a letter demanding money I didn't have. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that their friendliness was a mask, and soon enough the mask would drop. But what I couldn't see yet was that their constant presence, their notes, their reminders, weren't leading up to punishment. They were preparing for something much bigger that none of us could have predicted. And when that crisis finally hit, it wasn't going to expose the HOA as villains. It was going to reveal them as the exact opposite, in a way that would change everything I thought I knew about them. It all came to a head one stormy weekend, when the skies opened up in a way I hadn't seen in years, dumping sheets of rain across the neighborhood, until the gutters overflowed, and the streets looked more like shallow rivers than roads. At first I thought it was just another heavy downpour that would pass, but within an hour I realized something was very wrong. Water started pooling in my yard, inching closer to the front steps, and when I went down into the basement to check, my heart nearly stopped. The floor was slick with water seeping in through the foundation. Panic hit me hard. I scrambled for towels, buckets, anything to slow it down, but the storm kept pounding and the water kept rising, and all I could think was how much damage it was going to cost me. How quickly this house I had worked so hard for was slipping out of my control. I didn't want anyone to know, least of all the HOA, because in my mind they'd see it as a violation or an eyesore, maybe even fine me for letting my property fall apart. I tried to keep it hidden, but the problem was too big to conceal. The next morning I stepped outside to see that the whole block had taken a beating. Fallen branches littered driveways, trash cans floated in puddles, and several neighbors were standing around pointing at clogged storm drains. And right in the middle of it all, pulling up in that familiar white SUV with the HOA logo, was the president herself, clipboard in hand, surveying the damage. My stomach twisted as she walked toward me, and I braced myself for a lecture, maybe even a threat to get the water under control or face consequences. Instead, she stopped, looked at the soaked boxes I had dragged out from the basement, and said in the calmest, kindest tone, "Looks like you took the worst of it. Don't worry, we'll help you." Those words didn't register at first, not when I had spent weeks convinced they were out to get me. But before I could even respond, she was already on her phone calling in a cleanup crew the HOA kept on retainer for emergencies. Within an hour, 2 men with pumps and industrial fans were at my door, setting up equipment to dry the basement. I stood there in shock, watching them work, while the president reassured me that the HOA covered part of the cost through community funds and that I wasn't alone in this. The whole thing felt unreal, like I had stepped into an alternate universe where the villains of the story had suddenly decided to play heroes. As the day went on, more board members appeared, not to scold but to pitch in. One helped clear debris from my yard, another knocked on neighbors' doors to check if anyone else needed assistance, and soon it felt less like a neighborhood under surveillance and more like a neighborhood rallying together. I kept waiting for the catch, for someone to hand me a bill or a fine, but it never came. Instead, they encouraged me to file an insurance claim, gave me the names of trusted contractors who offered discounts for HOA residents, and even arranged for volunteers to stop by with meals while the repairs were underway. Every time I tried to thank them, they brushed it off with a simple, "That's what we're here for." That night, as I sat in my living room listening to the hum of the fans drying out the basement, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel since moving in: relief. For weeks I had lived with this knot in my chest, convinced the HOA was a looming threat waiting to make my life harder. But in the moment I actually needed them, they had shown up not as enforcers, but as allies. And yet part of me still struggled to accept it. I couldn't reconcile the warnings I'd heard with the kindness I was experiencing firsthand. Were these the same people who wrote all those letters? Was this just a one-time gesture, or had I been completely wrong about them all along? Those questions swirled in my head as I looked out the window at the storm still raging, knowing that the real answer would come not in this single moment of crisis, but in how they followed through once the waters receded. And deep down, I had a feeling that what I had seen today was only the beginning of a truth about the HOA that would overturn everything I thought I knew. I woke up the next morning half expecting the basement to be worse, or for a bill from the cleanup crew to be slipped under my door, but instead I found a voicemail from the HOA president checking in, her tone warm and almost motherly, as she asked if the fans were working properly and if I needed any more supplies. It was such a strange thing to hear that I played the message 3 times, trying to catch the hidden agenda that wasn't there. When I stepped outside, I saw 2 more board members in bright yellow raincoats helping a neighbor across the street drag a soggy carpet out to the curb. And when they noticed me watching, they waved and asked if I needed an extra hand. Fear threw me off balance completely, because the image I had in my head of these people was nothing like the ones smiling at me in the rain, sleeves rolled up, looking more like friends than the faceless enforcers I had imagined. A little later, the white SUV pulled up again, but instead of filling me with dread, I felt something closer to relief when the president stepped out with boxes of bottled water and cleaning supplies. She explained that the HOA had a small emergency fund set aside for disasters like this, and that it wasn't charity, it was just what the dues we all paid were meant to be used for. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was stand there, damp and tired, while she handed me gloves, heavy-duty trash bags, and a reassuring smile that felt more genuine than anything I had seen in weeks. The real shock came that afternoon when a small team of neighbors organized through the HOA showed up at my house without me even asking. They brought food, tarps, tools, and most importantly, their time. Some bailed water from the basement. Some helped clear fallen branches from my yard, and others sat with me to go over insurance paperwork so I wouldn't miss any crucial details. For the first time since moving in, I didn't feel like I was facing everything alone, and that realization hit me harder than the storm itself. Every hour that passed chipped away at the wall of suspicion I had built up. These weren't people waiting to catch me slip up. They were people who had stepped in at the exact moment I needed them most, and they weren't asking for anything in return. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to mention fines or paperwork or hidden costs, but it never happened. Instead, one of the board members quietly told me that the HOA would cover the deductible on my insurance claim if it put too much strain on me financially. And when I tried to protest, she just said, "We're neighbors before we're board members." That line stuck in my head for the rest of the night, echoing louder than the fans in the basement. I sat at my table surrounded by damp towels and muddy boots, trying to process how quickly my perspective was shifting. Just days earlier, I had been convinced these people were my enemy, that every envelope in my mailbox was a threat, but now those same envelopes seemed more like lifelines, small pieces of proof that someone was looking out for me. The strangest part was that the more they helped, the less it felt like an HOA at all. It felt like a community, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing until now. By the time the storm finally broke and the skies cleared, my house was battered but standing, and so was my faith in the people I had been so quick to mistrust. Still, I couldn't shake a lingering curiosity. Was this kindness just a fluke brought on by disaster, or was it who they really were? I knew the answer would come soon, because recovery was only the beginning. And the way they continued to show up in the days that followed would prove once and for all what kind of neighbors I truly had. In the days that followed the storm, I kept expecting the goodwill to fade, like maybe the HOA had done their part during the emergency and would now retreat into the role I had always imagined, watchful, strict and ready to send another notice about some tiny misstep, but instead, they kept showing up in ways I couldn't ignore. One evening I got home from work to find my front yard already cleared of debris I hadn't gotten around to picking up, and when I asked around, a board member casually mentioned that a few volunteers from the community had taken care of it on their lunch break. Another day, I opened my mailbox and instead of a warning letter, there was a neatly folded flyer announcing a neighborhood dinner the HOA was hosting for everyone affected by the storm, complete with free food, childcare, and even a raffle for home repair gift cards. I almost didn't go, half convinced it was some kind of public relations stunt, but curiosity got the better of me, and what I found inside the clubhouse was nothing like the cold courtroom scene I had imagined weeks earlier. The board members weren't sitting behind long tables wagging their fingers. They were serving plates of food, laughing with families and asking people how they were holding up. The president herself handed me a plate of pasta and asked about my basement with genuine concern, like a neighbor checking in rather than an authority figure keeping score. For the first time I saw them not as a faceless institution, but as people. People who lived here just like me and who actually cared about keeping this place more than just tidy. Sitting there at a table with my neighbors, listening to stories about how the HOA had quietly helped cover repair costs for elderly residents or arranged temporary housing for a family whose roof had caved in, I realized how much of my fear had come from assumptions, not from anything they had actually done. And yet, even with all this kindness, a part of me still clung to the idea that there had to be a catch, because the version of the HOA I'd built up in my head didn't match the one I was now seeing with my own eyes. That suspicion flickered again when one of the board members invited me to attend the next HOA meeting. But instead of politely declining like I normally would, I decided to go. Determined to finally see what really happened behind those closed doors, I braced myself for the worst, imagining rows of neighbors being called out and scolded for every violation. But what I walked into was closer to a brainstorming session than a courtroom. The agenda wasn't about punishing people, it was about planning community improvements, budgeting for shared spaces, and figuring out how to better support residents during future emergencies. People spoke up freely, sometimes disagreeing, but always with respect, and when the president turned to me and asked if I had any ideas, I froze, realizing for the first time that they actually wanted input from someone like me. Walking home that night, I couldn't deny that the wall of mistrust I had built was cracking fast, because every sign pointed to the truth I had been avoiding. This HOA wasn't out to get me, and maybe it never had been. But as much as I wanted to accept that, I knew my final judgment would come not from meetings or dinners, but from the way these people continued to show up when life got messy, because that was where their true character revealed itself. It was only when the dust from the storm had truly settled that I began to notice how much had changed in both my neighborhood and in me, because where I had once seen the HOA as a shadowy figure lurking with clipboards and fines, I now saw neighbors with rolled-up sleeves and tired but genuine smiles. And the more time I spent around them, the more I realized how far off my assumptions had been. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of voices outside and peeked through my blinds, expecting to see another argument about lawn heights or parking spaces, but instead, there was a group of board members planting new flowers along the community entrance, their hands muddy, their clothes smudged, and one of them humming, while another cracked jokes that made the rest laugh so loud I couldn't help but smile. Later that day, when I walked my dog, one of the board members waved me over, handed me a shovel and asked if I wanted to join. Not in a pushy way, but like it was the most natural thing in the world, and before I knew it, I was digging beside them, sweating under the sun, and realizing how good it felt to do something simple and useful for a place I lived in, but had never really contributed to. It was during that work, with dirt under my nails and the sound of kids running around with popsicles in the background, that I started seeing the HOA less as an us versus them situation and more as a collection of people trying, imperfectly, maybe clumsily at times, but trying all the same to build something worth being proud of. My old suspicions didn't vanish overnight, of course, and I found myself waiting for the other shoe to drop. But every time I thought I'd caught them being the code enforcers I had feared, they surprised me instead. Like when Mrs. Hernandez from 2 doors down had her car break down and, instead of issuing a notice about it sitting in the driveway, the HOA pooled funds to cover half the cost of her repairs and even arranged for a local mechanic to give her a discount. Or when the Johnson family lost their beloved dog during the chaos of the storm. The HOA printed flyers, organized search groups, and didn't stop until the dog was safely back home, tail wagging as if it had never been gone. These weren't grand gestures meant to impress outsiders. They were small, steady acts of care that stacked up until even someone as stubborn as me had to admit that the picture I had painted in my head was wrong. And then came the day that sealed it for me. My basement repairs. The ones I had been dreading were finally finished, and I hosted a small get-together to thank the few neighbors who had helped. But what I didn't expect was the entire HOA showing up, arms full of food, folding chairs, and even a banner that said "Welcome Back Home," strung up between 2 trees in my yard. They laughed, ate, and stayed late into the evening, and as I stood there watching the lights flicker across familiar faces, it hit me that I had spent so much time bracing for conflict that I had almost missed the community I'd always wanted being built right around me. In that moment, I knew my story with the HOA wasn't about enemies or endless fights. It was about being wrong, learning to see people differently and finding that sometimes the very group you fear most might just turn out to be the one holding you up when you least expect it. And though I wasn't ready to admit it out loud just yet, deep down I knew this was the beginning of something I hadn't anticipated at all. Trust. Looking back now, I realize the biggest twist in this whole journey wasn't the storm, or the damage, or even the letters that used to make me so anxious, but the way the HOA managed to completely overturn everything I thought I knew about them. Because in the end, what stood out wasn't a rule book or a warning notice. It was the people who stepped in when life got messy and showed me that community means more than just living side by side. When I tell the story now, neighbors sometimes laugh and remind me how suspicious I was, how I grumbled about hidden agendas and prepared myself for battles that never came. But what really lingers in my memory are those moments where kindness caught me off guard, like the warmth in their voices when they checked on me after the flood, or the quiet determination in their actions when they helped rebuild what I thought was lost. I can admit it now. I was wrong, and not just wrong in the casual sense, but so off the mark that I almost missed the lesson entirely. Because sometimes the things we fear most only look intimidating from a distance, and when you step closer, you see the people, not the myths. My HOA didn't just fix my yard or help with repairs. They changed the way I looked at trust, at neighbors, at belonging. They taught me that compassion doesn't always announce itself with grand speeches. It slips in through steady hands, late-night phone calls, and the quiet assurance that you're not alone in facing what feels overwhelming. I thought I was bracing for a fight, but what I found was family, unexpected, imperfect, and sometimes messy, but family nonetheless. And as I stand here now, watching the lights glow softly across the neighborhood we all rebuilt together, I can't help but feel grateful that the story I was so certain would be about conflict turned out to be something far more meaningful. Proof that even in the places we least expect it, kindness can find a way to change everything.